Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
In 1912, Vladimir Lenin wrote in an article called Two Utopias that in politics, utopia is a wish that can never come true. But he goes on to suggest that it doesn't stop politicians from trying to evoke it and to use it to their advantage, which is what we will be seeing in this video, and I will be explaining that. Lenin was writing about two types of utopia that he saw. One coming from the liberal utopia that involved political harmony and political liberty, and then one from something he calls the Narodnik utopia, which is based on economic emancipation. One was the idea that political struggles will come about without a violent clash, and then the other is that the economic struggle must come about through a violent clash, but maybe the rewards of that struggle wouldn't be quite as great as they were promised. Now, what we've just seen in the opening video is the 1952 presidential campaign for Dwight Eisenhower, and it was a successful campaign. And I wanted to open that, first of all, because I found it while going through YouTube and thought it was an interesting thing to share with you. But second of all, is that I think it begins, or it is an example of utopia being presented in a political broadcast. Okay, so what you see in there, you see all these Americans coming together, good Americans coming together in a time of peace and prosperity to vote for one president. And I think this is an example, certainly not the first and by no means the last example, but I think it is an example of utopia being presented by a political candidate. What I want to share with you today is my theory that the second half of the 20th century was one giant utopian project. Okay? And I'll do that by using Lenin's words again about from the Utopia article from 1912, and he says this. He says, "The less freedom there is in a country, the scantier the manifestations of open class struggle, and the lower the educational level of the masses, the more easily political utopias usually arise, and the longer they persist." Right? So that is freedom, class struggle, and education. And the three clips that I'm going to share with you today and we're going to watch, I think represent this idea of freedom, class struggle, and education. The first video that I'm going to present to you is from our good old friend Eisenhower, who was speaking in the 1950s to financial leaders in the world and encouraging them to become stable economies to ensure peace and prosperity around the world. Where the video comes from, I don't know. Okay, I will carry on trying to find where it's from, the source of it, the summit that he was speaking at, but I just don't know for the moment. Now, what I believe that people would have feared the most after the Second World War is open class struggle. Okay, it was a time for the world to decide, okay, which direction are we going to go on? And what the United States wanted to do was make sure that there was no class struggle. Right? And the way that they would do this is through strong economies, and through strong economies you can have a strong military presence which will ensure stability. So what this is saying is, what I'm saying here is that this is the political utopia that he was trying to create, is because there was a class struggle going on in the United States, but one that was masked with the prosperity. So, if you think about what the 1950s is, technological advancements in the USA, in France you've got les Trente Glorieuses, etc., etc., etc. So you've got this economic drive to oppress, or rather to ignore, class struggle, much as I would say as we saw in the years following 1848 with the revival of public works and these huge public constructions, principally to satisfy the desires or the emotions, the passions of the working class.
Sound economies are the backbone of successful defense, because successful defense must be indefinitely sustained so long as there is any threat to national security in the world. They are essential not only to the maintenance of our military establishment, but also to the creation of those conditions of well-being which are in a very real sense a primary line of defense for the entire free world. It is important that we remember that what each of us decides in his own country affects the fortunes of the rest of us. Each country can render a great service to every other country by keeping its own economic house in order. The world is shrunk, and our sense of interdependence is keen. So too must be our sense of cooperation. That nations choose to act cooperatively through these great international organizations is ground for confidence that your decisions here and at home will be wise and sound.
The next video that we're going to see is one that emphasizes the very complicated ideological struggle of freedom. Now, it is a famous speech by President Ronald Reagan made in 1987, and symbolically it is in Germany, and it is behind the German Wall, okay, or the Berlin Wall, sorry. And the Berlin Wall came to symbolize the struggle between Western freedom and Soviet, I suppose, Soviet ideals, okay? And by this point in 1987, Ronald Reagan knew that the United States was winning the ideological battle against the Soviet Union. And so he's standing in front of this wall, and he addresses the people. He talks about the free sectors of the city. He says that as you'll see, he says that if Gorbachev seeks liberalization, if he is truly interested in opening up, then he will open this gate and he will tear down this wall.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
What I think this video shows is that the United States was playing on the idea, be it a stereotype or be it a reality, that under Soviet Union there was very, very little freedom, and that that's what we say is true. But what therefore the United States could play into to the whole world, because of this, they could create this utopia of liberalization, of freedom, of financial gain. They could use this lack of freedom to instigate a political utopia. or to make people think of a utopia. So anyone listening to this speech by by President Reagan, all over the world could go, yes, of course, that is what we want. That is, there is no freedom. That is the ideal that we want to have. The third and final video that we're going to look at now is on the other side of the pond, over in my home country of Great Britain, and this is Tony Blair's speech in 1997, and he became known for this idea of education, education, education. And what he did there was identify the third element in Lenin's statement from 1912, though I'm not saying that those two are linked. And he educated, and he realized that there was a need for better education, and he wanted the state to become responsible for the improvement of this education. So again, the utopia that he can evoke for parents of children is this idea of your child will be educated. In this utopian world that we are creating, don't worry, your child has a place because the state will look after them and the state will educate them. So he can use, he used this utopian ideal of education in order to convince voters to choose him. And in fact, the 1997 general election saw a landslide victory for Tony Blair, and that actually established 13 years of Labour rule in Great Britain.
Forget the past. No more bosses versus workers. We are on the same side, the same team, and Britain United will win. Ask me my three main priorities for government, and I tell you, education, education, and education. And I tell you my vision of the future. I would like a state education system in Britain, so good, so attractive, that the parents choose to put behind us the educational apartheid of the past, private and state, and I don't believe anything would do more to break down the class divides that have no place in a modern country in the 21st century. Well, if they had been in that gym, if they had talked to those parents, sitting on those tiny chairs where once their children had sat, they would have been emotional too. I believe that we should ban the private ownership and possession of handguns. Britain has the presidency of the European Union in the first half of 1998. One of our key priorities in that presidency will be the completion of the single market. Well, today, even in opposition, I set a deadline. June 1998, the end of the British presidency for the completion of the single market in Europe.
My final comment on all of this is that the 20th century was abruptly ended in 2001 with the attack on the US soil against the trade towers, the Pentagon and other areas. And what then we were transformed to was the 21st century, and the 21st century seems to have lost its utopian element, and that is what we will be explaining or discussing next week. And we might also try to examine what actually are the utopian elements left in the 21st century, and I do believe they are there, but I do believe that they are more in the form of iPhones and drugs. Okay, so we can talk about that another time, but I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I'll see you shortly to discuss it.